Hi, I'm Deanna Springer.
And I'm Dana Casey with a fun Stitch It Sisters sewing project and classic time-saving tips by Nancy Zieman.
First, let's take a look at the project we're making today. We'll be stitching our I See Spots quilt. It's a modern quilt that's bed size, but it looks great on a bed or a wall. We'll be stitching I See Spots with Confetti Cottons by Riley Blake, Clover's 5-in-1 sliding gauge, Pellon's white soft shape interfacing, and our new I See Spots quilt pattern. Cast aside traditional curved piecing techniques and learn Nancy Zieman's way of creating carefree circle blocks.
Create a circle quilt without ever cutting a circle or stitching opposing curved seams.
We'll begin making our I See Spots quilt by selecting fabrics. Be sure to choose 8 fabrics that are an assortment of lights, mediums, and darks. Next, we'll prepare our fabrics. Head to the ironing board and steam press and starch all of the fabrics before you begin. Then we'll cut our fabrics. We'll be cutting our fabrics and interfacings needed for the quilt blocks. So after we've steam pressed and starched our fabrics, I'll just move these over to the ironing board. We've already starched and pressed our fabrics for the quilt we're making today. And then we'll cut some blocks. We'll be cutting squares. We're cutting an assortment of 9.5-inch square blocks, which make 9-inch quilt blocks. We'll also be cutting some larger quilt blocks. Who said quilt blocks have to be square? We're making some rectangle blocks. So our rectangle blocks are cut 9.5 by 18.5 rectangle quilt block. We'll cut an assortment of those. And the pattern tells you exactly what to cut from each color and in how many sizes and shapes to cut.
Yes.
So after we cut some rectangle blocks, we're cutting some large square blocks. So we need some large square blocks for our large spots. So these blocks are cut 18.5 by 18.5 inches. But before we get to the quilt blocks, we need to make some spots. So let's show how we made those spots. We start by layering. We've cut our applique block or our spot square 6.5 inches. We've also cut our fusible soft shape interfacing 6.5 inches. So for every spot square of fabric, we need to cut a square of interfacing fabric. And again, we're making circle quilt blocks without ever cutting a circle. We're starting with squares. So once we cut our squares, we do a little tracing, but we have to find the center of the block. We fold our fabric square and find the center point. And you could mark that with a marking pen, right in the center, or you could just go with that fold. And the next thing we'll do is get our 5-in-1 sliding gauge and we'll set the cursor for 3 inches. We're making 6-inch circle spots, so we want to make sure we trace a 6-inch circle. So half of 6 is 3. I'd press the center button and then you'll trace. You'll trace all the way around, and it's easier on slanty board, the padded board. You'll do it on your cutting table at home that's a firm surface, but we'll trace circles. So we've traced our 6-inch circle, and then we need to stitch. We'll head to the sewing machine and we'll set our stitch length for a 2.5 millimeter stitch, a close, tight stitch length.
Okay.
And we'll stitch. We'll stitch all the way around that circle. Once we've stitched all the way around the circle, it's time to cut. To cut the circle spots, we use a pinking blade in our rotary cutter. So we'll head to the rotary cutting mat, and I like to turn the mat over. Cut on the back side of the mat when you're using decorative rotary blades. It'll save the life of your mat, extend the life of your mat.
Good tip.
So we've cut away the outside of the circle or the spot with the pinking blade, and we've just left 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch all the way around. You don't want too much fabric, but if you cut away if you leave too little fabric, you could pull the seam open.
Oh, sure.
And too much fabric, it'll be too bulky when you turn it.
Okay.
The next step is to do some cutting. So we'll cut away the inside of that interfacing. And I like to leave about 3/4 of an inch. And you just cut, and I'm only cutting that fusible interfacing layer. And I should mention, the fusible side, the glue side, is facing up. You would think that the glue side would be facing the fabric, but you don't want it to face the fabric. So when you make your stack, make sure the fusible dot side is facing up.
Okay.
So we'll continue cutting all the way around, and then we'll do some turning. And we like to turn with Clover's point-to-point turner. And we just turn the spot right sides out, and then we take the point-to-point turner and we smooth that seam. And because we've pinked that seam, it naturally just rolls to the wrong side. It's like magic. So just like that, we have a turned applique circle. The next step is to head to the ironing board, and we do a little pressing. We press from the wrong side and adhere the adhesive of that interfacing to the back of the circle spot.
Okay.
And that gives us our finished circle. And the next step would be to make all your circles. So we've taken the next color, it's actually 6.5 inches.
Okay.
And a 6.5 inch interfacing square. Same size. Finish making all of your spots. And we trace our circle. We're doing a lot of tracing with that 5-in-1 sliding gauge. We're making a lot of circles. You could shortcut and make one circle of each size with a template plastic.
Yes.
So just use the 5-in-1 sliding gauge and create one circle in the 6 inch. And then all we have to do is trace the exterior.
Okay.
And then one in the larger 9 inch.
Because there's a lot of circles to be tracing around here.
Right, I see a lot of spots. So we can shortcut that. The 5-in-1 sliding gauge is great, but we know we're making a lot of circles. Make a template. We always like making templates and patterns to make the process easier. Same process with the larger. We can bring that template back and we can trace around. We'll trace around to make that large circle. And again, we've taken the glue side of the interfacing facing up to the right side of the fabric square. And we'll trace all the way around that circle. And the next sample shows that we've already traced and stitched. So we've stitched along that traced line. So it's really a straight stitching line, even though it makes a circle. You're stitching with a 2.5 millimeter tight stitch length. Tight stitch lengths are easier to turn curves. If you imagine a larger stitch length, it'd be a more choppy circle and it wouldn't turn as well. You want a nice tight stitch length for stitching circles, and that's a classic time-saving tip from my longtime friend Nancy. Shorten that stitch length when you're sewing circles.
Okay.
And we know the next step. We'll cut out that inner circle. We'll cut out that inner circle the same way. Just because the circle is larger, the seam allowance doesn't become larger with the interfacing. So just pinch that interfacing and then trim it down to about 3/4 of an inch. An inch is too much and a 1/2 inch is not enough. But it can be rough. You know, it's not an exact thing. It's a little forgiving. And then be sure to trim all the way around the outside with the pinking blade. So here's our spot. I did it backwards, but you can see it works either way. And you'd trim out that inside of that circle. And you'd turn it right side out and you'd have the large spots. So that's the circle making step. It doesn't get much easier than that. And again, the pattern tells exactly how many of each spot to make, what colors, and what size. The next step is to attach our spots to our quilt blocks. As you would guess, the smaller spot goes on the smaller block. And to position our spot on our block, we just fold. So I've just folded this as quarter, and you can take the roll and press and just press. You don't want a firm press. We don't want to take an iron to this. We don't want those press marks to be permanent. So we just want a little finger press or a roll and press that can be pressed out later with a steam iron.
Okay.
You do the same thing with the background square, and you find that 1/4 inch mark. That's how we've placed. It's just quarter folding the background block, quarter folding the spot, and then we'll pin that into place. And this one's already stitched. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but we'll pin those to the background fabric. We'll head back to the sewing machine and we'll stitch. We'll stitch that center circle or applique spot to the background fabric. We'll stitch all the way around the outside of that circle, attaching that spot to the background fabric. We like to use a blind hem stitch. It takes stitches, 3 or 4 straight stitches in the background fabric, and then a zig and a zag onto the spot. It's a nice stitch, and it holds the spot to the background fabrics.
Okay.
You could choose a straight stitch. You could zigzag these. The choice is yours. You're the designer. And it's the same process for attaching the spots to the larger blocks.
Okay.
So we can imagine the same process, only larger. This is a beautiful modern color combination. The other option for double checking to make sure your spot is in the center of the block is to use that 5-in-1 sliding gauge and take that measurement and make sure that the center circle or spot is in the middle of the block. And again, we are making some rectangle blocks, but we're not putting the circle spot in the center of the block.
Okay.
We're offsetting it the same way we folded the spot in the background fabric in finger pressed or did a little bit of roll and press to find that center. But it's not a center fold for that. We're using that method of measuring the 3 sides and making sure those 3 measurements are the same. And then we know we have the spot in the block.
And we have this spot 1 3/4 inches down from the top.
And that means then all the way on the 3 sides will be 1 3/4. And you don't need to worry what this measurement is. And that gives the quilt some movement. We'll create all of our blocks in all of the sizes, and the next step is to assemble the quilt. So in this illustration, you can see our assembly process. We assemble the quilt into sections, some of them columns, and some of them sections, and we stitch them together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. We didn't add any borders to our quilt, but you certainly could do that. This is a beautiful queen size quilt that again looks great on the wall or on a bed. And this was such a great project. We sent it out to our long arm quilter, Susan. Let's take a look at her amazing stitches.
This fun modern quilt is a great quilt for beginners as well as seasoned quilters.
We hope you've enjoyed the Stitch It Sisters project. You'll find this pattern along with a limited number of project bundle boxes at stitchitsisters.com.
Be sure to tune in again for another Stitch It Sisters sewing adventure.
In the meantime, connect with Stitch It Sisters and friends on our social sites. Stitch It Sisters is made possible by Bernina, Clover, Riley Blake Designs, OESD, Oklahoma Embroidery Supply and Design, and shopnzp.com.
Bernina, made to create.